Okay, so today we'll be talking about medical 3D printing, and what exactly that entails is we'll be talking a little bit more about the practicalities of how you actually do a startup or how you bring a product into clinical reality, which is through a methodology called biodesign. We'll then talk a little bit more about biocompatible materials, so the different materials that are available to people who are innovating medical 3D printing. And then we'll be talking about what's sort of happening in medical 3D printing right now, so we can sort of inspire you for your project. And then finally, we'll be sort of closing up with what the project actually looks like. All right, so we talked previously on Monday about the different disciplines of medical technology, and so they fall into the realms of digital health, medical AI, medical devices, and drugs and biotechnology. So right now we're operating in the medical device space, right? And so it's good to just be aware of that because there are different, for example, regulations and different processes between sort of different disciplines. And different disciplines also have completely different pathways, right? So let's take a look at also, and before sort of jumping in as well, another sort of way to slice medical technology is what stage you're operating at. So for example, some people operate at basic research, so that's generally research labs that sort of do fundamental research for an upcoming technology. Then you have translational research, which is trying to bring that basic research into clinical sort of reality, right? Then after sort of the research phase, so if you move out of a university, it's generally a startup or spin out, as research or universities like to call them. And then after that is an established company, which is, for example, you already have a successful product and you want to make more. So people often sort of look at this matrix here to see where they'd like to operate, right? So have a think about where you personally, for example, might like to operate if you do end up in medtech in the future. And obviously a career is long and you can sort of spend time in different areas, right? Like I personally sort of spent time in an established company, in a startup. I've previously done translational research and basic research, so sort of all four. And primarily for these two, but also now a little bit for our research lab going into drugs and biotech because some of the skills are very transferable. So again, just think about what you might sort of be interested in. Now, in terms of entrepreneurship, there is a bit of a spectrum between what different pathways actually look like. So on the far end here, we have software startups, which are generally a lot lower capital, so a lot less money, right? You need a lot less money to build software. And the reasons for that is a lot of software is open source, right? A lot of like when you build software, it's really quick sort of cycle times. You build a software and then you just simply ship. Or something like hardware, as you can imagine now that you're starting to 3D print and produce things, right? It takes time to actually produce something to get the materials in. It's unlike software where you can just simply download a software and start using it, right? And therefore that leads to sort of shorter timeframes as well. The next is digital health here. So digital health is obviously a software startup that's involved in medicine. And the reason why it's slightly longer is because there's things like quality management and regulatory approval that you need to obtain. So it does take longer than just a simple software startup. In the middle here is medical devices. Okay, so just a quick note on digital health. This generally takes about, I would say about 5 to 10 million minimum. So that's roughly the sort of range of money you need, and about 3 to 4 years minimum as well. So you see digital health startups sort of succeed within that time frame. For medical devices, you need around 10 to 50 million, potentially up to 100 million. And that takes around 5 to 7 years is the average, right? Sometimes it can take longer, sometimes it can take shorter. Implants, pharma, and bioengineering is unfortunately the longest. So those are generally lead times of about 7 to 12 plus years. And usually around 100 million to $1 billion is roughly what you need, just because the sort of clinical evidence that you need for these approaches are very, very high, right? Because you're obviously editing stuff at the really micro level, and there's sort of high potential for things to go really wrong. And then sort of final and outside of medtech is what's called deep tech. And so deep tech is like sort of inherent in the name, but it's like you're really deep in your company for a really long time. And so that's stuff like SpaceX or like, like really sort of long plays like Neuralink, that sort of thing, where it's like super, super deep tech. And again, very high capital, very long time frames. You're talking sort of like probably like 20 years to get a product out, right? And that's 20 years of your life. All right, so a quick sort of note about the biodesign methodology. So this is a clinical innovation methodology that's been particularly successful. So it was developed at Stanford in 1998. It's a repeatable process for clinical innovation. So they take complete amateurs and they pretty much turn them into experts in a process of 9 months. And people who sort of go through that program succeed once and then they keep on succeeding over and over again because they just sort of follow the process. And it's sort of specialized in turning a research or product into clinical reality. So actually bringing it to the bedside, right? Like all the steps that you need to take. And in its 25 years, they founded 50 successful companies, which is pretty high. If you think about it, that's 2 successful companies. So successful meaning IPO or acquired at some point, in per year, pretty much. And they're sort of caught, like the amount of people they teach is roughly about 50 to 100 every year. So just imagine sort of us having a class of 100 people and 2 people, 2 teams out of that every year will end up succeeding. They've impacted about 13 million lives with their devices. They've raised quite a lot of venture capital, so 1.2 billion, and also created a bunch of jobs as well. So their sort of methodology is based initially on what's the initial design methodology, which is a sort of methodology that came out of the 1980s, which is, before you create a product, you need to actually understand the user and empathize with them first. And then you start defining the problem, then you brainstorm, and then you prototype, and then you test. Okay? And then this design has also sort of been refined into what's called the double diamond, which is you have 2 phases. One is the problem, one is the solution. So the first phase, you focus on just solely the problem. And then the second is solely the solution. And in each stage, you need to have a lot of ideas, then you select the best ones, then have a lot of ideas, and then you select the best one. Okay, so that's true also for the problem. So you see, ideally, hundreds of potential problems, then you select the best one. Then you think of hundreds of potential solutions, then you select the best one. And so they found that this sort of diamond technique to be particularly effective. And so this was sort of initially proposed by a very famous company in the design space called IDEO, which is sort of almost like the sort of parent of all the design methodologies that we currently use right now. They're based in San Francisco. And this sort of goes back to the heart of what we were discussing on Monday, which is good design ultimately matters, right? Like when you're sort of designing products, there's obviously an inherent joy in seeing your product and understanding that it's quite beautiful, right? But at the same time, designing it so it can be easily used by healthcare workers, particularly, for example, under pressure or in a sort of emergent situation where they don't have time to be thinking about how they're supposed to use this device, but they want to be thinking about something else as well. All right, so sort of back to the BioDesign methodology, it has 3 key stages, and we'll go through each one, sort of a high-level overview of each one. And so the first stage is to identify an unmet clinical need. And so this sort of follows, again, the double diamond structure where you sort of observe, you talk to people in a hospital, right? And you find hundreds of potential unmet clinical needs, and then you screen them and you select the best one. Okay, so again, following the double diamond structure. Now, the second step is once you have a really good problem to work on, is to invent a good solution. And again, it follows that structure of generating and brainstorming lots of potential solutions, prototyping the best ones, and then selecting the best solution at the end, right? And then the final one is implement, which is after you have a good problem, a good solution, is to figure out your strategy, right? And one of the sort of key things of the BioDesign methodology is that once you have sort of all this in place, you need to really sit down and actually spend a few months just figuring out what your actual strategy is on a number of key domains, right? Because if there is something that is that goes wrong or doesn't sort of fit into place, your project is going to die in about a few years anyway, right? And so you sort of need to sit down and figure out the strategy ahead of time and make sure that it sort of works out. So the first sort of step before even all of this is what's called the strategic focus. And that's just figuring out a focus that meets the needs of the innovator, right? So some people have completely different personal missions, for example, completely different things that they're passionate about, completely different sort of areas of unique insight, right? And what they hope to sort of accomplish in their life. And so it's just something to sit down as you're sort of going through your medtech journey, like what is it you want to accomplish, right? What is it you want to work on? What is it you're particularly passionate or good about, right? What is it something that you have unique insights about? And what's sort of your personal mission and how does that all tie together, right? It's just something to, again, just to think about, just to sort of be aware that it is something that you should think about as you're shifting through your career, right? There's going to be lots of decisions or tough decisions you have to make. And, coming back to these, it's always a great sort of North Star. Now, what exactly is an unmet clinical need? So it's sort of inherent in the name. Unmet means that it's not currently solved or poorly solved. So you obviously don't want to be working on a problem that's already well solved, right? There's almost no point in doing that, right? Clinical means that it impacts patients, consumers, clinicians, or health services. So not only just patients, but also it might be a problem that is impacting clinicians right now or hospitals at large. And then the need means that if a solution exists, it would become essential. Okay, so if you manage to create a solution for it, it will become something that is essential and widely used in clinical practice. Now, unmet clinical needs consist of 3 components. The first is a problem. So a problem is the issue from the user's perspective. Now, say you're working with patients This means that it's an issue from the clinician's perspective. Okay, so that's why you need to talk to a lot of clinicians in this state. That is limiting the quality or affordability of care. So you need to talk to clinicians and actually understand what sort of issues they're having with patients, right? The second component is the population. So who is the subgroup of patients or providers or health services? So let's just stick with patients for now. Who is the subgroup of patients you're actually working with, right? And you need to think very carefully about this. So when I see like, when I assess translational grants, that sort of thing, we always see people just say, we're just going to treat everyone who has a heart attack. And that's almost never true, right? You never capture literally everyone who has a heart attack. Maybe it's, for example, females who have a heart attack, or is it, men above 65 who have a heart attack, right? There are sort of very specific demographic circles in every disease that you're specifically targeting, right? Very rarely are you able to actually target with a single solution everyone who has a disease, right? That's almost near impossible. So you have to sort of think about what the sort of population segments are and which ones are the most highest yield for your product. The final one, which a lot of people miss, is what is the outcome? Okay, so right now, unfortunately or fortunately, we have a lot of administrative staff in hospitals, right? Which means that they make a lot of purchasing decisions, sort of decisions about what to buy, right? And so you need to think about the outcome from their perspective. Like, who is the person who's going to pay, who's actually going to make the buying decision? Usually it's not a clinician, right? Because once you operate as a clinician, you realize that you don't buy the stuff that you use, right? You don't buy, for example, the syringe that you use. You just sort of use what's available to you, right? And so that sort of purchasing decision is made often outside of clinical practice, right? So there's often, for example, in hospitals, a purchasing department. They sometimes will ask for advice from clinicians, but they will make that decision themselves, right? And so you have to think about, and so this is what an outcome is a quantifiable metric, because a lot of people like to work off KPIs these days, right? Compelling to the potential purchaser of the solution. Okay, so in a hospital setting, that's usually the purchasing team or someone who has influence in the hospital. In a clinic, that might be, for example, the practice manager or the head GP or the head sort of clinician in a clinic rather than every other clinician, right? So you need to sort of understand that dynamic and why exactly they actually buy it. Okay, so that's sort of the thing that people miss. Now, need statements themselves, or sorry, unmet clinical needs can be represented in what's called a need statement, which is just simply a sentence that says what the problem, population, and outcome is. Okay, so it's a way to solve a problem for this population in order to what's the outcome. Okay, so an example of that is a way to improve mobility for stroke patients in order to reduce the cost of rehab. Okay, so that's like sort of an example of a need statement. So in here, we talk about what the clinical problem actually is. And then we talk about what the potential patient population is. And we talk about what the outcome is to a potential buyer. Okay, now this is, again, a very imperfect need statement. So we actually spent at Stanford probably like a month or 2 months just working on this single statement, right? Because this single statement indicates the team's ability to understand what the actual problem is, who exactly they're targeting, right? Are you really going to target all stroke patients? Probably not, right? And what the actual perspective of the buyer is, okay? And what KPIs are really important to them. So this is something that we get pretty much eviscerated for like a month straight on, right? And then you start to learn about how you can create a good need statement and actually understand the problem. All right, so let's go through some examples. So say that you're on you're sort of in the community, right? And you observe that an elderly patient has been discharged with physiotherapy and social work follow-up, but it did not happen. Now, what's a potential need statement for this? So please just think about it for a few minutes in your tables. So I'll just go back to what a structure of a need statement is. That is a structure of a need statement. I can go back to the observation as well. So what's the problem, what's the population, and what's the potential outcome to someone who's actually going to buy it? The discharge, just for those who are frequent, discharge from hospital, right? So they were on the geriatric ward, they were provided physiotherapy and social work follow-up, but it did not happen. Just looked at the file and it never happened. What is the need statement?
Plus, like auditor had lost them, lost it, and so on.
Alright, any thoughts on the problem, population, or outcome? Any suggestions? There's no right or wrong answers, yeah.
Great. A way to increase allied health follow-up for recently discharged elderly patients to improve patient prognosis.
Okay, that's a reason one. So can you say a problem again, population and outcome? So let's sort of try and break it down. So problem first.
Problem is allied health follow-up.
Alright, help follow. Okay, how do you know that's the problem?
It appears that there is a lack of it and it's been prescribed, so presumably there is a need.
Could there be other reasons why allied health failed to follow up?
Potentially, yeah.
Like what?
Well, I mean, the problem is that it's not happening though, right?
Yeah.
So, like, regardless of the reason for it, that's the problem, right?
Okay, yeah, but there could be other reasons for it, right? So for example, there could be a medical record breakdown or
Yeah.
something, right? No one just got the message, right?
That is
Or
true.
they're completely swapped, and so there's a backlog of people, right? There could be, like, what other sort of reasons could there be?
Yeah, it could just be that the patients aren't getting the right.
Yeah, or the
information.
patient didn't go,
Yeah.
right? Like, yeah, okay. And then, so that's the problem. What about the population?
I had recently discharged elderly patients. to be
Okay, yep, so it could be, you could specify that further, so it could be, for example, like geriatric patients or patients post falls or whatever, right? And then outcome?
Outcome, improve patient prognosis.
Yeah, so that's a little bit vague, right? Like,
Yeah.
what is that a quantifiable metric that you can show to someone and be like, hey, you know, our product improved that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so as you can see, it's sort of a lot more nuanced than you might expect, right? And actually, this is a bit of a trick question, but the answer is you do need to actually dig further into the problem, right? And you need to actually speak to a lot of people on the ground, you need to speak to the patient, ask what happened, you need to speak to, for example, social work and PT, right? And so, fortunately, so like with something like this, you sort of need to think about how you can sort of tear out that nuance, right? Because if you can understand more about the problem, the population, or the outcome, generally you have all these unique insights, right? Into how you can sort of tackle the problem. And so if we sort of move on to the next one, what sort of questions here would you ask, right? So you observed on the ward that an anesthetic registrar struggles to intubate a patient, leading to a med call, right? What sort of questions should you be asking, or what should you be curious about in this situation as an innovator?
I mean, like, are they trained?
Yes.
Uh,
So is it a training issue, right? Is it, for example, like they've just haven't been trained, or, yeah, sorry, go on.
Oh, yeah, like, are there enough registrars at the moment?
So it could be a capacity issue for sure. What else?
Is there something wrong with the intubation?
Yeah, is there something inherently wrong with the intubation? Could it be an equipment failure? So what else? I was gonna say. Yep, anything else? Is it, for example, a difficult case? Okay, so for example, you know, in an anatomy perspective, right, there's just people who honestly are more difficult to intubate based on the Malapatis score, right? So you have to sort of dig in, right? And that's obviously just the problem as well. But for example, what's the population, right? Like what kind of patient is it? Are they in for a surgical procedure? Are they on the wards, in the medical wards, something else, right? Is it something that's systematically happening, or is it just a random event, right? You know, do med calls often occur from this, right? Like you have to sort of dig into the data and sort of understand. And a sort of key thing as well with the outcome is that a sort of trick that we've seen is you always sort of speak to the anesthetic team, for example, or the surgical team, so sort of the related clinical teams, and ask them what their KPIs are, right? So for example, some anesthetic teams might have a KPI if they want to reduce the amount of med calls related to intubation, right? And so that could be a sort of clear outcome that they'd be willing to pay for, right? So that's sort of another trick as well. All right. So sort of moving on. So back to sort of our needs finding. So so we talked obviously just about one observation, but to do this right, you sort of need to be in hospital and actually talk to people and observe lots of different problems. And so as part of the by design process, it's sort of expanding the number of problems that you see to potentially tens or hundreds of different problems and actually sort of digging a little bit deeper, right? And then you start getting all these sort of insights across a problem space about things that you can work on. So needs finding is generating hundreds of potential needs, and beyond sort of observations and validation interviews as well, there's 4 things that people often research and is good practice to research when you're working on a problem. The first is the clinical and disease process. So are there sort of any unique insights you can get from understanding the clinical and disease process further? A lot of treatments or a lot of sort of new therapies come from seeing a disease in a slightly different light, for example, or understanding some sort of mechanism that people haven't previously understood. So for example, one that's related to obesity is, drugs like Ozempic just understood that there was another pathway that could actually be exploited, right? And, we were just talking yesterday about how lupus, they've just found a new sort of drug target for it. So those are the sort of insights that you sort of want to have as soon as you sort of trying to look to develop a new therapy. Now, what's the competitive landscape? So obviously, is it a very rich competitive landscape with lots of people trying to make different things, right? Or is it a very limited clinical landscape? So there are some fields where there's very few sort of therapies available, right? Fields where, there's fields where there are always lots of different solutions because there's been a lot of money in that field. So historically, those fields have sort of been orthopedics, cardiology, neurology, right? Have been fields where there's been sort of lots of solution pushed forward. And so, what does the competitive landscape actually look like? Is there a gap somewhere based on what you're seeing? The third is stakeholder analysis. So who are the people actually involved in this decision, right? Who are the people involved in clinical treatments, in clinical diagnosis, and actually follow-up of the patient as well? Have you actually spoken to everyone, right? And not only just doctors, but nurses, anyone else, allied health, who's involved in that, right? Because they'll probably have insights from their perspective that you want to obtain, right? And the medical sort of perspective is just not enough for innovation often, right? And so, so we, for example, in our startup talked to a bunch of patients with knee pain, right? Like when we were dealing with knee pain. And so stakeholder analysis is absolutely critical. And so one stakeholder that's often missed as well is actually the hospital admin, because hospital admin, again, makes a lot of decisions related to lots of different conditions. So actually talking to hospital admin can yield a lot of insights. Then the final one is market analysis. So the question is this, if you go on this project and you're going to spend the next 7 years of your life, is it actually worth the potential return, right? Because a lot of people look at projects they're willing to spend, say, like, $10 million on this, and then realize the market is just 1 million, right? That's almost like a pointless sort of exercise because you can never recapture the amount that you've lost. And so just understanding what the market actually looks like is also key. All right, once you have sort of hundreds of potential needs, then you do a process called needs screening. So this is where you actually just sit down with your team and then you think of really important questions. So for example, it's like, do we think this is a real need? Do we think the market is big and is the team interested? And then you just simply subjectively score what you think that is. For example, 0 is a no and 1 is a good, right? And then you just pretty much rank your need statements, okay? So this is sort of an objective process that you can always look back and go, this is the reason why we decided not to go for this problem. All right, so after sort of the identify step is what's called the invent step. So this is where some of our medical 3D printing stuff comes into play, right? And so before all that, you have to actually sort of brainstorm once you have a good problem to work on, brainstorm potential solutions, right? And sort of lo and behold, I didn't realize this when I was going through, but there are actually rules of brainstorming that RDO have sort of pushed forward, right? And are sort of good practices for brainstorming. And it's essentially stuff like, obviously deferring judgment. So don't sort of judge others on what their ideas might be, because that might lead to an insight that you didn't realize. Encourage absolutely wild ideas. So a lot of medical technologies have actually been created because someone was like, what if we do that instead? Or what if we have sort of this wild idea, right? It might sound completely implausible, but there's probably a reason why that sounds so wild. Build on the ideas of others, stay focused, one conversation at a time, be visual. So this is something obviously a sort of fun time to be creative and one of the few times we can start to play with different toys and sort of, explore different ideas. And so even today, when you're sort of brainstorming problems and solutions, sort of embrace that, right? Because very few times, I think at very few times in your medical degree, do you get to sort of be creative and sort of think of different problems and different solutions. And this is a really critical skill set for potential entrepreneurs, because when you're actually running a company, half the time it's just figuring out how to creatively get around potential problems, right? And that's sort of one of the skills that a lot of really good entrepreneurs have. And then go for quantity. So obviously don't go for quality. You want to aim for like hundreds of potential ideas, hundreds of potential solutions, sort of just go for quantity and go as sort of wild as you can. Now, after brainstorming is prototyping. We talked about this yesterday. The heart of prototyping is figuring out what your greatest technical risks are, right? And then de-risking it in the most efficient manner possible. So using the least amount of time, effort, and money, right? Whether that's, for example, 3D printing or cardboard or simply drawing out something on a piece of paper, right? It's just sort of a good skill to have. And this is, again, a sort of good mindset to have even after you have finished a prototyping stage and you have a full-blown company. You still want to achieve technical milestones with the least amount of time, effort, and money possible. Okay, so that's just a good mindset to have. Even if you're working in industry, so for example, you're part of an industry team, you want to achieve your technical goals with the least effort possible. And so 3D printing is really key here. And then after you have sort of a lot of different concepts that you've experimented with, then you screen it again, but in this time it's a much more objective screen, and we'll go through sort of these different things here. But you need to cover things like intellectual property. So are you actually violating someone else's patents? Do you have the ability to create your own valuable patents? Regulatory pathway. So do you have a clear regulatory pathway? So can you actually get regulatory approval? And we'll talk about what exactly that means. Do you have a pathway to reimbursement? So a way to actually get money from Medicare, right? So we won't talk too much about these parts, but again, it's from a business perspective. Does Medicare fund your product? So for example, if you create a product, will Medicare actually fund it, right? Because if they don't, how the hospital system works is that if the hospital spends on your device, they expect to get paid back by the government. Okay, if they don't get paid back by the government, it means that they'll spend on your device and they'll be out of pocket because they can't get paid back by the government, right? And so how that works is you need to get what's called Medicare reimbursement. And so the ability for Medicare to actually pay the hospital back for something. Then finally, do you have a reliable business model? So is there a way to actually capture the value that you create for people who use your device? All right, and then the final step is implement. So implement essentially just asks one key question, which is, do the stars align for you, right? So before spending any significant sort of time, effort, or money, which is sort of months or on the order of tens of thousands of dollars, you want to make sure that everything is green, right? So what does green actually mean? So if we go back to this concept screening here, we use the traffic light system, which just indicates whether something is good to go. Yellow is there's some risk, but you might be able to sort it out. And then red is like there's some serious risk with this approach, right? And so you want to make sure that sort of everything that you cover is green, and we'll cover what the sort of different things you need to think about are. But it's always good practice just to invest a couple of months thinking about your strategy before committing for the next 3 to 10 years. And this sounds really simple or like really basic, but a lot of people don't do it, right? Like I see researchers all the time who just go, I prefer committing 10 years to a project that might die rather than just spending 2 to 3 months figuring out if something might work, right? And sort of learning the hard way that something might not work now. All right, so by design strategy. So this breaks down into sort of 3 key areas. So one is clinical strategy, the second is technical strategy, and the third is operational strategy. So clinical strategy covers these 3 aspects here. So we'll dive a little bit more into regulatory and clinical trial, right? Regulatory because it's the most important one. Clinical trial because a lot of doctors are expected to understand clinical trials, but you actually don't learn anything about clinical trials in your medical degree, which is sort of a bit funny, right? Because once you graduate, you sort of have the expectation that you can draft an entire clinical trial strategy, but most people don't know how. And so what exactly does this mean? So regulatory strategy asks the question, does your product require regulatory approval? Okay, and we'll go through again what that means, and if so, which class. Clinical trial strategy covers what clinical evidence does your product actually require? And this generally falls into 2 categories. One is to demonstrate that it's actually safe, right? And then the second is that it performs what it intends to do. Okay, so for example, if your product intends to treat AMIs, does it actually treat AMIs, or is it just complete, utter crap, right? And then the third sort of aspect to consider is clinical adoption, which we won't go through as much, but it's like, how will you encourage clinicians to adopt your product? Okay, so what's the strategies to actually bring this so that a lot of people actually end up using it? So technical strategy covers these three things here. We'll go through each one of these just because it's important. So R&D is what are the greatest technical risks? So that basically goes, okay, what are the sort of key things you need to demonstrate from a technical standpoint that this is going to work, okay? Sometimes it's manufacturing risk, so it's almost near impossible to manufacture your product. So you need to actually demonstrate that it's possible to manufacture. Sometimes you don't know if a certain sort of like electrical and mechanical combination will work. Sometimes you don't know if it's like certain materials that might work. So those are sort of the key technical risks that can pop up. And the question related to that is, how are you de-risking with R&D? So what's your strategy, right? So obviously the best engineers have an excellent strategy to figure out, okay, I need to do this first, then I need to prove this, then I need to prove this, right? So they also work from a scientific perspective, which is, like what are the sort of key questions you need to answer from a technical and research perspective. Related to this is what's called QMS, which is how will you manage product quality? So how will you ensure that whatever you create is actually quality enough to be used in a medical setting? Okay, as you can imagine, there are very strict controls on quality for medical devices, right? You can't just sort of use any old thing, right? And so people are very strict on this, and we'll go through this in particular detail because 3D printing does rely on this, right? You have to prove that your 3D print is actually good enough to be used in a clinical setting. Now, we won't go through these as much because these sort of cover a lot more different things, but intellectual property is more of a legal question, right? So how the patent system works is that when you invent something, so say you're the first person to create something, right? You are allowed a patent for 20 years on that invention, okay? And what that means is that you have complete monopoly over that for 20 years. So only you are allowed to make it, okay? And if anyone else makes it, then you can sue them, right? And so these patents are very critical for a lot of companies because they will invent something and then they have complete access to that thing for 20 years. Okay, and so a lot of these startups, a lot of these companies rely on patents in order to protect themselves from other competitors, right? And so there are sort of two questions that you need to answer from an IP perspective, which is, do you have freedom to operate? So freedom to operate, meaning that are you violating anyone else's patents, right? Have you invented something accidentally that someone else has already invented and has a patent for, right? And are they going to sue you? So that's freedom to operate. And then patentability is, does your invention have the ability to actually be patented? Okay, so can you actually patent stuff and protect your invention so that you can sue other people in case they try and copy you? Okay, so that's what IP sort of goes through. Now, operational strategy, we won't talk about this very much at all today because it's sort of not as technical, right? But you need to answer these three questions, which is hiring a team. So who are your key hires and advisors? Do you have a good team together, right? Because one person can't do everything. Do you have pre-market funding? So will you rely on research grants or venture capital, right? Do you actually have what it takes to get venture capital? And what are the key milestones and amounts you require? So is this a project that, for example, requires $1 million, $10 million, 100 million, or billion, right? And do you have to actually have the capability to get those amounts? And then post-market funding, which is after you have successfully launched your product on the market, what is your business model? Okay, do you have actually a sustainable way to make money, right? And how will you obtain Medicare reimbursement? Now, historically, this one has been the most challenging by far, right? Which is how do you get regulatory approval, right? So we'll go through again what that means, which is you need to actually get permission from the FDA, TGA, or CE mark, depending on which geography you're in, to actually sell your device. So the vast majority of medical devices, you need permission before you can sell. And the only way to get that permission is through clinical trials, which demonstrate that it's safe and effective or can perform. Okay, so historically, that's been sort of the biggest concern. But recently, the biggest concern has been Medicare reimbursement. Okay, the reason for that is a lot of healthcare systems have started to grow beyond sort of their means. And so politicians are trying to decrease the amount of money that they can spend on the healthcare system, rightly so, right? And so because of that, Medicare has been a lot more strict about what they're happy to pay for, right? They have been a lot more strict. They're not going to pay for anything, right? And so new devices are sort of always at risk of not getting paid. And if hospitals don't get paid for using your device, it just means that they won't buy it, right? Because they're going to be losing money every single time they use your device, okay? All right, so regulatory strategy. So these are the three regulatory bodies. So the FDA is in the United States, CE is in Europe, and then in Australia we have the TGA. Okay. Now it does simplify a little bit because the TGA just follows CE. Okay. So there's a couple of reasons for it, but because we're a smaller country, we have to rely on someone else's system, and so we decide to rely on CE Mark system. Okay. So there's sort of, again, two main regulatory systems in the world. It's one, the United States, and two, CE. So there are sort of two key questions when dealing with regulatory strategy. The first is, does your product actually require regulatory approval? Okay, it's a legitimate question. Do you actually need to get permission from the TGA? And the answer is always, it depends, right? And I'll tell you some situations, particularly in 3D printing, where you might not need regulatory approval. Okay, it's just something to be aware of. So broadly, the answer is yes, if you make a medical claim. Okay, so that is, if, for example, your product treats, diagnoses, cures, blah, 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 a disease. Okay, so if you do anything with a disease, then it requires regulatory approval. Okay, and sort of if you think, maybe I can hack that system, if it smells like it should be, then it is technically regulated. Okay, so some people or some famous companies have tried to go, yes, we diagnose, we don't, it's like a blood test, but it really doesn't diagnose anything, right? And they're like, they look at that and they're like, well, yes, it does, right? And so therefore it's a regulated product. So sort of famous example of that is Theranos, which is a company about 10 years ago, tried to make a product which could diagnose every condition, right? Like they literally said that. Because of that, they're like, well, we're not trying to diagnose a disease, but it's like many diseases, or like, it's just like a general blood test, right? And the FDA were like, no, that's clearly a diagnostic, right? And so hence it's a regulatory approved product. All right, so where does the sort of line get drawn? So for example, if you create a mental health app that says you're treating major depressive disorder, this is clearly a regulated product, okay? Because you're treating a disease, okay? If, for example, you say you're improving happiness, then this is not treating a disease, so it's not a regulated product. Does that make sense? And then if you say something like treating sadness, then it's a bit of a gray area because it's like, is that a disease? I don't know, right? And so it really depends on what you're claiming your app to be. Again, if you do something like this and you have the evidence for it, and you can get it approved, then clinicians will trust it more. And if you say something like this, then it looks less to be a clinical product, right? You're just trying to improve happiness. But again, it's sometimes a gray area. All right, the second question to answer. So if your product is actually a regulated device, then which class is it? So classifications are risk-based, according to the FDA or CE Mark or TGA, which means that they classify based on the risk, and then they obviously have heavier regulations for higher risk devices, okay? And so the CE Mark and the FDA have two sort of systems, and if you recall that Australia follows the CE Mark system, which is these Roman numerals here. And so how it works is 1 is equal to low risk, 2 is equal to moderate risk, and then 3, and I forgot the 3 there, is equal to high risk, okay? So let's go through some of the sort of basics of things like personalized medical devices. Actually, before I go through that, I'm going to just quickly talk about what these timelines look like. So this here often looks like things like let me think, like a Q-tip or like a scalpel, for example, sort of really more basic devices, right? These are generally electronic devices. So for example, let's say like things which are external to the body that uses some sort of electricity for the body, or MRI machines, CT machines are often sort of these. And then high risk is often implants, okay? So pacemakers, brain-computer interfaces, that sort of thing are all considered high risk. This here is a very quick process to get approval, so it takes a few months. This here takes a few years, and this here often takes 5 years, 5 to 10 years, okay? So it's sort of very long. So for example, if you're Elon Musk and you work on Neuralink, you have to know that it will take like at least 10 to 15 years to get something approved. All right, so a sort of a good guidance to be aware of is this guidance, which was just released in December last year. And it talks about how you can use 3D printed devices in Australia, right? And so they have a couple of categories, and we'll go through this entire sort of this flow chart later about which device is which. But a sort of key category that they have is what's called patient-matched medical devices. So these are medical devices which are manufactured within a specified design envelope to match a particular individual with production processes which can be validated and verified and reproduced. Okay, so we'll go through sort of each component there. So manufactured within a specific design envelope means that you have certain min and max dimensions, for example, certain performance limits, certain environmental limits for operation, and then or certain material specifications. Okay, so just think about when you're 3D printing something, you do specify, for example, a maximum dimension or minimum dimension. This could be. So, for example, if you're creating an insole, right, there is obviously a size of how big someone's feet might be, right? And so you can specify these this sort of design envelope. So you say, okay, when we manufacture these insoles, they're only going to be within these specific size. All right. Now, the sort of next part of this definition is it's designed to match a particular individual. Okay, so a lot of 3D printed stuff are designed to match a specific person. Okay, so does it match a particular person? If it does, then it could be a patient-matched medical device. And then the final is that you have a production process which can be validated and verified and reproduced. So what exactly does that mean? So this process here is essentially the design process for a medical device. And you start off with the user need, which is what does the user actually need? You need to document this. Then you say, okay, because based on that, I'm going to design this. And then you're going to design it. And then you have a design output, which is, for example, the 3D printed part that you finish, right? And then you have a medical device. Verification just basically confirms that your design output, so what you specified the design should look like, is actually true. Okay? So that's verification. And then validation means that your final product actually meets the needs of the user. Okay? So that's verification, validation. And so if you have any of these processes in place, then it is a patient-matched medical device. Does that make sense? Okay, so these again are for devices which are much more common. Now, there is a low volume exemption, which means that if you only make 5 or less patient-matched devices per year, then you don't need regulatory approval. Does that make sense? So I'll just repeat that again. If you make 5 or less of a device per year, right, then you don't need regulatory approval. But that being said, you still need to tell them, for example, if there's an adverse event, you need to report it to the TGA, you need to pay your fees, and you also need to follow advertising rules, right? So if you are making a super custom-made medical device, so less than 5 per year, you don't need regulatory approval, okay? So just again, something to be aware of. I don't know if you might end up in this situation. All right. Now, another category that the TGA sort of has talked about is what's called an adaptable medical device. So these are mass-produced medical devices, which is intended to be assembled or adapted based on the manufacturer's instructions. So for example, you might provide like clay, like cranial clay, that helps with reconstruction implants, right? And so obviously that needs to be adapted for the patient based on what they're missing on their skull, right? And so if you provide something like that, then it does require standard regulatory approval. All right, another category which Australia's talked about is the custom-made medical devices. So this is a medical device intended for the sole use of a particular patient or health professional. So for example, it is something that is not routinely made by the manufacturer, nothing else exists, so you can't find anything else on the market. There's a written request by the doctor, and it is not possible to collect safety or performance data because you're only creating a single device. If that's the case, then there is no regulatory approval, but it's still considered a regulated product, so you need to keep all your records, okay? So that's just, again, another category to be aware of. All right, the final category, I believe, is what's called the medical device production systems. And this is when you provide an entire system with raw materials and production equipment to a healthcare facility. So for example, there is a dental crown furnace in a lot of dental practices, which is they actually make the dental crowns themselves inside the clinic, okay? In that case, it is a regulated product with the class of the highest risk product which can be produced. Okay, so again, a regulated product. So when can you sort of avoid TGA approval? It's usually when it's less than 5 things being made of something, right? Which is patient matched. Okay, so just being aware of that. I don't know if you want to sort of, ever sort of be in that situation, right? But beyond that, you do need TGA approval for most 3D printed stuff. Okay. All right, so this is, again, a flowchart that you can find on the TGA website that just answers or covers what we went through, which is your device actually something that is TGA approved, okay? So again, something to be aware of if you ever do decide to do research in this or you want to actually provide it to a patient. All right, R&D strategy. So, this is essentially just an extension of the prototyping, but these are the different models that you can make, right? And some of these are particularly great for 3D printing. So a works like model is a model that actually works like the real thing, right? It feels like one is the one with an exterior material that can be useful, right? Looks like, so this is particularly great for 3D printing. What does the actual final product looks like? And then is like means that it's a model that matches all three of these. All right. So I just had an example here of just what the low risk and high risk products look like. So low risk products are things like band-aids, apps, mental health apps, or scalpels. So surprisingly, scalpels are considered very low risk. And then high risk stuff is things like hip joints, pacemakers, and ventilators. Okay. So anything in between is usually 2, but it might float between 1 and 3, just sort of depending on risk. All right. Now, clinical trial strategy. So a brief sort of note on clinical trial strategy, so you're familiar with the terminology. But drugs have 4 phases, okay? So 1, 2, 3, and 4. And devices have also 4 phases as well, but they're not numbered. They are named, okay? So 1 corresponds to first in human, 2 corresponds to early feasibility, 3 corresponds to feasibility, and 4 corresponds to post-market. And what you're trying to prove in each one, for 1, is that your device is actually safe. The second is that it's safe and effective. Third is that there's statistical significance for safety and effectiveness. And then 4th is that it's okay for widespread use, okay? All right, clinical trial strategy. So just again, some very, very quick notes. But it does cover around 50 to 80% of your company's expenses as a startup, okay? So it's something that you just have to be aware can lead to a lot of money sort of being used. And often the range that you find can be on the range of $2,000 to $500,000 per patient. Okay, so can you imagine just like a 10 patient sort of clinical trial? At this range, it will cost already 5 million. Okay, so this is again the sort of cost that you see for drug trials, right? You're going to expect around 500K. For device trials or for digital health trials, you expect more in this range, so 2 to 10K. But it can be anything from 20 to 50K. I've seen all sorts of stuff in trials. And then before you do a clinical trial, you need to get approval from an ethics committee. Okay, so in Australia, so for example, Monash University has an ethics committee that you can apply to, right? So you do need to get this, right? Like a lot of people don't understand this for some reason, and they just sort of try and do a clinical trial without ethics approval, which is you're gonna get sued, right? But in the United States, this is called IRB, so Institutional Review Board. And in the United States, you also need to get approval from the FDA before you do any clinical trial, okay? And so that just adds sort of extra time and costs. In Australia, when you run a trial, you can get 43.5% of your money back. Okay, that's sort of a really important point if you ever intend to do a trial. And therefore, it's a very popular destination, even for the US, right? But we have this sort of funny dynamic where a lot of US companies will go to Australia, and then we're sort of like guinea pigs for them, and then they'll leave, and then they don't actually bring the device back because the market's too small. Okay? Anyway. And the goal, again, similarly to prototyping, is to demonstrate safety and effectiveness as efficiently as possible. So you want, again, minimal patients, just demonstrating that it is safe and effective as efficiently as possible. All right, now a quick note in QMS. So this is something that you need to be aware of if you ever decide to bring your 3D printing or some other project into clinical practice. But you need to set up quality management systems, okay? And we'll go through what that sort of means. So every device that you make needs to adhere to specific standards, okay? So ISO and ISC standards. And so you have a set of what's called primary standards, which are standards that all devices must follow, okay? And then a secondary standards, and there is one special 3D printing standard that we'll go through. So the first standard you need to follow is biocompatibility, which means that you need to demonstrate that the materials that you're using are actually biocompatible. Okay, so what exactly does that mean? So this is, again, risk-based. So depending on, are you a device which will just stay solely on the surface of the skin or outside of the skin, right? Are you a device that is communicating, for example, with blood, tissue? So for example, like a cannula that is communicating with blood or something inside. And then the final is, are you an implant? Okay. So these correspond to class 1, class 2, and class 3 biocompatibility. So why that's important is later on when we talk about materials, you can actually look up what class it is, okay? And you need to make sure that, for example, if you're building an implant, that you're using class 3 3D printed materials. Does that make sense? Okay, if, for example, it's a surface device, then you can use any of these, but obviously this is more expensive, so you end up using class 1 anyway, Okay. Now, the next sort of standard that you need to adhere to, and some of this is less appropriate if you're just doing 3D printing, but it's more appropriate if you're doing an actual medical device, is you need to demonstrate electrical safety. Okay, that just means that you're not going to kill the patient accidentally with a voltage spike or a giant shock or something that actually leads to damage, right? You need to demonstrate mechanical. So this is again for bigger devices like MRI, CTs, that you're not going to accidentally kill someone with a moving part, that there's not going to be some instability, like a component just sort of falls off, right? Things like heavy weight or stuck fingers. And then there's a couple of other things as well. Just you need to demonstrate that, for example, your device is not going to catch on fire, right? There's not going to be sort of like sterilization issues or any usability issues as well. Okay, and then the third and final standard that you need to adhere to, or sorry, third standard you need to adhere to, is what's called electromagnetic compatibility, which just indicates that your device is not going to send weird electricity to the grid, right, and sort of fuck up the whole grid, or other electromagnetic energy to other devices, okay? So you're just going to like interfere with a CT machine that's upstairs or something, or an MRI machine that's downstairs. EM susceptibility means that your device itself is not going to be impacted by grid disturbances or other devices, okay? So you just need to again demonstrate that your device can operate safely with other ones. The final standard is software, and so this is again more related if it's mechatronics or an AI project or something, right? But there are 3 different classes, and it's just based again on risk, and you need to just keep different documentation based on what software you're creating. Okay, so whether the software can be particularly dangerous, you need to have all these sort of documentation. And if your software doesn't have that much risk, then you can just keep minimal documentation about your software. All right, and now there is a sort of final 3D printing standard that just got released last year. But again, it doesn't apply massively to things, but it's just based on whether you are using CT or MRI modeling to create a 3D printing thing. So if you're involved in a project where you are using CT or MRI reconstruction to recreate a 3D print, then you need to follow this standard, okay? All right, now sort of a quick note as well, but there is now sort of a starting media traction at least for device companies that just simply leave their patients out in the lurch. So they sort of do something to their patient, then they go bankrupt, right? And so they can no longer support their patient. This is sort of a horror story of a neurotechnology company, so a brain-computer interface company that actually put implants in the clinical trial. You cannot take it out, but then they went bankrupt, right? So what do you do then, right? Like these patients are pretty much have this neural interface in their brain, but they cannot be further supported, right? And clinicians don't know what to do either because the company's gone. So you don't even know who to speak to, right? So again, just something to be aware of, which is a sort of methodology called designing for failure, which is what actually happens if your company fails. Do you have like sort of an exit strategy for the patient? Because at the end of the day, you don't want to be harming them if you accidentally go bankrupt, right? Now, this sort of is famous in the automobile industry, which is they actually design cars to be crashed, right? Where these cars crumple up here and it actually accepts a giant, huge sort of amount of the force, thereby saving the people in here, right? And so I want you to think when you're designing sort of medical devices or 3D printing, what happens if something fails, right? You should know what actually happens when something fails and what should your device do when it fails, okay? So you sort of need to have that in mind. So when we're working, for example, in our medical device, right? We go, okay, if, for example, there is a voltage spike of 50 volts, right? What is actually going to happen to the device, right? Is the patient going to get killed because there's a shock? Or are there sort of internal mechanisms that kick into place and then protect the patient? Okay? So again, just thinking about designing for failure. All right, next is biocompatible materials. So this is just a sort of quick tour on biocompatible materials. So there are sort of 4 main classes that you can use for 3D printing. The first is polymers, which are essentially repeating subunits of a certain material. I didn't know what polymers were, so I sort of looked it up. And these are particularly great for things like skin cartilage, eye implants, or drug delivery devices. The second are composites. So composites are combined materials, so materials that have combined properties. So again, it's taking the best of both worlds of different materials and then combining them. And these can be useful for biosensors and implantable microelectrodes. And then you have the sort of classic ones, right? So you also have metals, which is things for orthopedic screws, dental implants, things that are really sort of requiring a tough material. And then the final is ceramics, which again, also tough, bone replacements, dental implants. So we'll go for each one. So the first is polymers. Polymers are lightweight, flexible, low cost, right? So they sort of look like this, right? You can imagine they're sort of stretchy, very flexible, right? They're great for things like soft tissue applications and drug delivery applications, right? So that's sort of dealing with flexible sort of membranes. And these are the very common ones. So PLA, PEEK, poly, reframe, nylon, resin, and silicone all have biocompatible versions of them. And so those are sort of materials that you should look out. And they're also very well supported by the 3D printing industry. The next is ceramics. So ceramics are tough, heat resistant, and chemically inert, which is great for things like orthopedics and dental applications, right? So these are the sort of common materials you'll see again, like hydroxyapatite, zirconia. Bioactive glass is a material that actually helps with bone regrowth. So it's pretty cool sort of material, and then TCP as well. The third is metals. So metals, high strength, they are bioresorbable, meaning that after a long time, they actually get resorbed back into the body. Okay, so obviously as you move along in life, you need some zinc, you need some magnesium from time to time. And so it actually steadily goes back and provides you some of that zinc and magnesium, which is somewhat cool, right? So just something to be aware of. Again, very useful for orthopedics, surgeries, stents, and teeth, right? So that's sort of where you see metals. And these are the different alloys that you'll see, as well as stainless steel, okay? All right, and then the final one. So composites are a sort of mixed bag because it's just merely a combination of two different materials. And so you'll see polymer ceramic, right? So this is, again, mechanical strength and osteoconductivity. So it allows you to graft to bones, right? Again, very useful for bone and tissue. Polymer metals, strong and biodegradable, so good for ortho. Polymer, so these are flexible, tunable degradation. So this is starting to become a very hot area of drug delivery, which is, can you actually fine tune a certain drug to be released very slowly over 6 months? Okay, so a very big company right now, for example, is one that's doing this for joint pain, which is they put bupivacaine, like a local anesthetic, into a polymer, right? And it just slowly releases. You literally slot it in after the surgery, right? Or during the surgery, and then it slowly releases pain relief over 6 months. Okay, so again, sort of new approaches. Carbon fiber. So again, very high strength to weight ratio. So this is a material that's extremely lightweight, but it's incredibly strong. And so it's started to get commonly used in cars, but also things like orthotics or prosthetics as well, right? Because you have sort of that really high strength to weight ratio. And it also is good for radiolucency. Nanocomposites, these are very popular for neuro implants. Okay, so one of the challenges I said about brain-computer interfaces is we're trying to create really thin and strong materials, sort of less than a micron in diameter, because you prevent brain inflammation, right? And so therefore, whoever can design that is going to create the next sort of big BCI company. And then hydrogel is the final one, which is very useful for soft tissue wounds and vessels. These are basically gels that are sort of liquidy in nature, and so you can sort of put it on soft tissue. All right, again, back to the biocompatibility thing, but do be aware of what exactly you're intending to use it for, and make sure that you use a biomaterial of the appropriate class. Okay, so whenever you're looking up biocompatible materials, it will always specify what class it is, okay? And that corresponds to what you intend to use it for. All right, so finally, let's go into the project. Oh no, before that, so medical 3D printing, which is what exactly is happening. So there's been a couple of hot areas in medical 3D printing. The first has been obviously just orthotics and prosthetics, sort of the original medical 3D printing field, and just being able to design for that. But again, it has been a little bit crippled by the fact that regulatory approval is required in a lot of circumstances, right? Meaning that you do need to get regulatory approval, you need to demonstrate that it's actually safe and works for these patients. One-off prints. So a couple of people have sort of exploited that less than 5 per year thing to create one-off prints. And so some people, for example, have created sort of like a tracheostomy thing that allows you to sort of improve breathing, but also things like cranial reconstruction, okay? It's been useful for pre-operative planning. So this is where that standard comes in, which is you're actually scanning someone with CT or MRI before the surgery, and then you're creating a real world sort of anatomical structure so that surgeons can think about how they want to approach a certain anatomy, right? And so it's been particularly useful, I think, in surgery and sort of creating those one-off prints because it's not a regulated product, right? It's not something where you're treating or diagnosing someone with. You're just merely creating a model of their internal anatomy. Right, and this is another example of preoperative planning where you have sort of, for example, like a CT or MRI, and then you actually create someone's brain, and then it therefore allows the surgeon to plan what sort of visit, what direction or what pathway they want to use. Another example of preoperative planning, so also being used for vessels as well, so vascular surgeons. So we'll probably hopefully hear about that when Jason Twin comes next week, about how he's sort of thinking about our preoperative planning with vascular surgery. Right, surgical instruments. So some people have been thinking about using 3D printing for surgical instruments. Can you, for example, make a surgical instrument that's actually a lot more useful, a lot more robust, a lot more lightweight, right? So these might allow you to sort of do that as well. All right, patient and medical education. So here at Monash, we actually have a world-leading lab for medical education when it comes to 3D printing. So unfortunately, the guy just happens to be in Europe, so we couldn't get him here. But yeah, so this is, again, cool technology. I don't know if have you guys been using or seeing this at all? Yeah, cool. Okay, so you're sort of aware of it. Not only for medical education, but also for patient education as well. So actually showing patients what's happening inside. All right, now it's been used by pathologists, particularly the photogrammetry. So you remember that taking the images, taking a lot of images and then reconstructing a 3D model from it. So people have been using it just for pathology or sort of rare conditions so that you have an archive of what's actually happening around the world. Okay, so again, sort of cool project. All right, drug printing. So there's been a couple of drugs now which have been approved, which are 3D printed, right? And why on earth would you 3D print a drug? The reason is, again, it allows some of that depot sort of effect where you have a drug slowly released over a certain amount of time, or you can carefully control how it's actually released over a certain amount of time, right? And so a couple of sort of drugs here. So for example, this I believe is an anti-epileptic drug that's being 3D printed using these technologies here, right? These ones here, I believe, are devices actually, so implants. And then these ones here, so an IND, if you recall from the clinical trial side, is when you get approval from the FDA to actually do a clinical trial. And it seems to be used for things like rheumatoid arthritis or cardiovascular, some sort of cardiovascular disorder and ulcerative colitis. Okay, so again, these are sort of cool technologies that are coming up in the drug and pharmaceutical space. All right, bioprinting. So there's actually been some research. Again, this is very much in the research phase on bioprinting. So someone tried, for example, to print a heart valve there, right? This is printed skin for burn victims. And then this is actually a mold that someone put here so that they could build a nose. Okay, so the skin wrapped around this mold, and then you could actually harvest this nose for someone who had lost it to cancer. All right, so the project. So how will this project work? You will work in teams of 3 over the next week to do a couple of things. One is to define a need statement. So this is the sort of focus today, which is what sort of problems you actually want to work on, okay? And make sure to do your research. Just read up about things. We're also here to answer any potential questions. The second is to brainstorm potential solutions, okay? So we want to actually see you brainstorming, thinking of potential solutions. The third is to propose a viable solution using 3D printing, okay? And then the fourth is on next Friday to do a show and tell and also submit a quick Notion website that sort of covers the same things as your show and tell. Now, the unmet clinical need might be completely personal, so you're obviously welcome to share, if there's an unmet need that you want to work on, whether it's something for you as a clinician, so it's like something that you want to actually use in clinical practice or in a hospital setting, or something that you sort of want solved from a medical perspective. Now, the 3D prints may be just a prototype of your solution, so it could be that your solution ends up being like a metal thing or whatever. So it could be just the 3D print is merely a prototype, or it could be the solution itself to the problem, okay? Now, some restrictions here. We just require less than 6 hours, or 6 or less, sorry, should be an equal sign there, print time, okay? So obviously, please don't make something huge and very difficult to debug because it takes a whole day to print, or more than a whole day to print. There are sort of no other restrictions, but it can be mechatronics enabled, okay? So you'll be learning some mechatronics next week, but please check with us because we have a good idea of where you'll be next week. So if you want to introduce electronics or whatever, we can give you an idea of how feasible it actually is. All right, timeline. So today, you need to submit a need statement or give us an idea of the problem you're intending to work on by the end of day, okay? That can also include the solution if you've had some time to brainstorm. On Monday, you can brainstorm solutions and then design time, okay? So designing an actual model on CAD. Now, just one thing to be aware of is that the printing lab is going to be closed on Monday. So you can't print anything on Monday, okay? So please submit any intermediate prints that you want on Tuesday morning, okay? And then we'll go down and print it for you, / you can go down and print it together at around 10. And please make sure to use Hypothesis while you're designing, okay? So some of you started printing stuff last night, right? And you probably learned that you need to print often and learn often from what mistakes you're actually making, okay? So the sort of ideal case for me is that you actually submit multiple intermediate prints that are assessing different design hypotheses, okay, rather than sort of one big giant thing. Okay, we want you to sort of have that scientific approach, try to answer questions, try to ask the right questions. All right, so on Tuesday after the print, we're going to cover Mechatronics 1. On Wednesday, you get those prints and then you can refine your design and keep on designing, okay? Thursday morning, you need to submit your final print, okay? This is a hard barrier because we only have 1 day to print before the show and tell. And you obviously don't want your show and tell to have nothing to show, right? And so please submit your final print. And this is sort of first thing in the morning because if something goes wrong, we can still have time to troubleshoot it on Thursday afternoon. And then on Thursday, we'll cover a little bit of mechatronics and then you'll have some preparation for the presentation in the PM, okay? And then Friday is show and tell. Now, just again to sort of stress that point, really have a lot of design hypothesis and sort of small prints to answer the hypothesis, right? Rather than sort of one giant print that you sort of bet everything on, okay? So please sort of have that mindset as you move forward. All right, now the show and tell. Actually, before we move to the show and tell, any questions about the project or the timeline? Any questions? Cool. Okay, yeah, you can access these slides afterwards. All right, so the show and tell, what is it going to be? It's going to be hopefully really chill. So it's just like a 10-minute presentation and a 5-minute Q&A. Just can share about your need statement, what your sort of different solutions you talked about, your design process and any decisions that you made, a little demo of your product, and then just anything related to by design or real production consideration. So what actually is required to make this a real thing. And again, really no pressure. It's really just an opportunity for us to hear about the story. So no one's marking you or anything. It's just really just you sharing about what the design process looked like. Now, also to create a Notion website. So this is again, just so that you can share the project with sort of the world, right? But it's just the same thing here, but in a Notion website. So we'll just create a little Notion website for everyone. We can just sort of document what's happening. All right, and then after the show and tell, you can sort of relax and we're going to have our guest speaker. So Jason Twen is going to come from the Austin and UML to share just what he's actually doing from a vascular surgery perspective for his research. So he's one of the leading names, probably the top leading name in Victoria for medical 3D printing. So it's going to be really cool to sort of hear about someone who's working in this field, has been working in this field, I think for 5 to 10 years now. So someone extremely experienced in this field. All right, and then afterwards, so we're going to finish at around 2. So we're going to bring everyone to the knot, and then we're just going to eat and drink, okay, and be merry until around 4, and then that's going to be the end of the medical 3D printing course. Okay, any questions? Okay, cool. So let's get started. So think about which teams you might want, think about what projects you might want to work on. We're here the whole day to help out.
Yeah, teams of 3.
Teams of 3.
Yeah, teams of 3. Teams of 3. Yeah, teams of 3. Oh, yeah.